Hey there, curious minds. Many of us grew up with certain ideas about biblical prophecies, right?
Hmm.
Especially those really dramatic ones talking about the end times,
Hmm.
right? We often imagine this far-off future. But what if? What if one of the most famous chapters, Matthew 24, isn't about, our future? What if it's a prophecy that already happened,
Yeah.
like completely fulfilled back in the first century? That's our mission today on the deep dive. We're looking at some fascinating sources, including a book called Matthew Chapter 24 as History
Mm.
by Mark Mountjoy. Our goal is to really pull out the key info, help you get informed on this, maybe give you a few aha moments along the way.
Yeah, this really asks us to, well, maybe set aside some common assumptions and just look at what the text and the history actually seem to show. We'll dig into the context, the specific predictions, and some pretty compelling evidence, actually. It points to a very different understanding.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. People love this chapter for prophecy stuff.
Hmm.
And it's supposedly Jesus talking to his apostles, what, like 72 hours before his arrest?
Exactly. And the setting is incredibly specific. Jesus and his inner circle, Peter, James, John, Andrew, they're leaving the second temple, the big one, in Jerusalem. They walk over to the Mount of Olives right opposite the temple, and the disciples are pointing out how magnificent it is, the stones, the gifts. And this detail is so important because it anchors the whole prophecy to that specific temple, the one standing right there, not some hypothetical future temple.
Wow, okay. So picture that. Jesus, his closest friends, looking right at this massive, beautiful temple, and he drops this bombshell. There shall not be left here one stone upon another. It shall not be thrown down, just
Yeah.
gone.
Exactly. And that's what prompts their questions. Three key questions. When will this happen? What's the sign of your coming? And the end of the world.
Hmm.
Now, the source, Mountjoy, argues these questions aren't out of the blue. They connect to things Jesus had already mentioned. Things like heaven and earth passing away, him coming within their lifetime, the consummation of the age, and crucially, that phrase, end of the world or end of the age, it likely didn't mean the end of the physical planet. It meant the end of the whole Mosaic system, that 1,400-year-old civilization, the second Jewish Commonwealth. The temple's destruction in 70 CE was the start, and it really wrapped up with the Bar Kokhba revolt later on. It was the end of that system.
Okay, so the context is really Judea, the temple, that specific time. And Jesus makes it super clear he's talking to them, the apostles, about things they will see. So what were the first signs?
Right. First, he warns about false Christs. Many would pop up claiming to be the Messiah. Then, wars and rumors of wars, nations rising against nations. But Mountjoy stresses this isn't like global conflict as we think of it. It's specifically about the local civil wars. The fighting between Judeans and nearby Greek cities, Scythopolis, Decapolis, Damascus, Idumea, all leading up to that big revolt against Rome.
So very specific regional stuff, not just vague predictions. He also mentioned famines, pestilences, earthquakes. Did those happen?
Oh yeah, history confirms it. We have records of earthquakes around then. Crete, Smyrna, Pompeii in 63 AD is another example. These were literal events. And he foretells persecution. Christians being delivered up, killed, hated by all nations for his namesake. The book really emphasizes this has zero to do with, say, the founding of modern Israel in 1948. This was the lived experience of the first century believers.
And that chilling part about betrayal. Many shall be offended and shall betray one another and shall hate one another. That paints a dark picture.
It really does. It reflects total social breakdown. Both rabbinic texts and Josephus confirm this. Friends turning informant, this pervasive, senseless hatred among Jews. Josephus even wrote that people almost preferred Roman ruin over suffering from their own countrymen. It was that bad.
Wow.
And you also had these false prophets telling people in Jerusalem not to flee, promising miracles, directly contradicting Jesus' warning.
This abounding iniquity, especially from groups like the Zealots, cutting priests' throats, dissolving the government, it sounds like chaos. And you're saying this was very much a Judean crisis, not Roman Empire-wide.
Exactly. Very localized to that region and time.
Okay, let's move to the Abomination of Desolation. This one gets debated endlessly. Future event, Antichrist, Romans. But this source has a different take.
A very different take, yeah. The common view is, the Romans bringing their eagle standards into the temple area in 70 CE. But Mountjoy makes a strong case against that. He points out the Romans were actually driven out of Jerusalem in late 66 CE. They suffered a big defeat at Beit Horon, lost thousands of troops. So from late 66 to spring 70, Romans weren't in the city, let alone the temple. In fact, Josephus says the Romans actually wanted to save the temple, not desecrate it initially.
Okay, that's a huge point. If not the Romans in 70 CE, then who and when?
The argument is it was Jewish insurgents. Specifically, the Zealots and their Idumean allies. They flooded into the temple complex around 67 CE, using it as a fortress during their own civil war. They committed sacrilege, stopped the daily sacrifices, basically desecrated the holy place themselves. This was the abomination.
Yeah.
And significantly, this happened early in the conflict, around 67 CE, before the Romans besieged the city. This was the signal for Christians to flee while they still could.
So the timing is critical, happens before the final siege.
Precisely. And it fits with Daniel's prophecy, too, the one about desolation lasting a time, times, and half a time, about 42 months or 3.5 years. That time frame matches almost exactly from the temple takeover in 67 CE to the Roman breach in mid-70 CE.
Which explains Jesus' incredible urgency about escaping. Make haste to the mountains. Don't even go back for your coat. It sounds like life or death, immediate flight.
It absolutely was. Flee like Lot from Sodom. Don't even look back. He mentions the difficulty for pregnant women, nursing mothers. It paints this picture of refugees just focused on survival. Nothing else matters. And this Great Tribulation wasn't primarily the Romans initially. It was this internal Jewish conflict. Zealots and others inflicting horrors on their own people. Josephus is graphic. Mass murders, bodies piled up, people terrified to even mourn. This 3.5-year period was the tribulation. And Jesus says those days would be shortened divine intervention to prevent everyone, including the Christians who hadn't fled yet, from being wiped out.
Okay, this reframing is significant. Now, the really big one, the second coming. Most people definitely see that as future. How does this view tie it to 70 CE?
Well, look at Jesus' own words again. He says, if anyone says, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it. Why? Because his coming wouldn't be secret or localized. As the lightning flashes from the east and shines to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. It implies a public, visible, undeniable event, and in this context is presented as a coming in judgment against that specific rebellious generation and state.
Right, but then you have the really dramatic language.
Yeah.
Sun darkened, moon to blood, stars falling. That sounds like the universe ending.
It does to our modern ears, yes. But the source argues this is standard prophetic language from the Old Testament. It's apocalyptic imagery. Ancient Semitic cultures use this kind of language to describe the fall of kingdoms, the overthrow of governments like Babylon or Edom falling. It didn't mean literal cosmic collapse. So the powers of the heavens shaking. That refers to the collapse of the entire religious and political structure of the Second Temple civilization. Its authorities, its systems, both human and spiritual, you might say.
Okay, so figurative language for regime change, essentially. But what about the sign of the Son of Man in heaven? Was that figurative too, or was there something literal?
This is fascinating. The book suggests it might have been something very literal recorded by historians. Josephus, the contemporary Jewish historian, he describes the Roman siege engines, the catapults, hurling these massive stones like 100-pound rocks into the city. And he records this curious prodigy. The watchmen on the wall, seeing these stones coming, would yell out in their language. They'd shout, "The sun cometh," as a warning cry. Ben Yidda, or something similar, apparently.
Wait, seriously. They yelled, "The sun cometh."
That's what Josephus reports, as a warning for people to duck. The Romans even started blackening the stones so they couldn't be seen easily against the sky. It's an astonishing potential link. And it also resonates with descriptions in Revelation about judgment coming like a storm of hailstones.
Yeah, okay, that's a specific historical detail I've never heard connected like that before.
Yeah.
Wow. Let's talk timing again. The parable of the fig tree seems crucial. Jesus says when you see its branch become tender, you know summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, right at the doors. And then that huge statement, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. How does this view handle that verse?
This is probably the biggest point of divergence. Mountjoy argues all these things refers directly back to the signs Jesus just listed, the wars, the flight, the tribulation, the fall of Jerusalem. These things unfolded within the lifetime of the apostles, near the end of their ministries in that first century. So this generation meant their generation. It did not refer to, say, the generation that saw the founding of modern Israel in 1948, which is a common interpretation in some circles. The book critiques that 1948 interpretation, the idea that the fig tree symbolizes modern Israel, calling it sort of a shell game that pulls the prophecy out of its original first century context.
Okay, but the objection always comes back. Jesus himself said, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." If he didn't know the day or hour, how could it happen in their lifetime? Doesn't that imply a much longer unknown delay?
That's a fair question. The explanation offered is this. Jesus said that during his earthly ministry, his incarnation, when he operated in voluntary subordination to the Father. So at that moment, he didn't know the precise timing, but he did know it would be within that generation. The idea is, through later revelation by the Holy Spirit, what the book calls revelatory progress in writings like First Thessalonians or Revelation, the specifics became clearer to the apostles after Jesus' ascension. So the lack of precise day and hour knowledge during his earthly ministry doesn't negate this generation time frame. The destruction of Jerusalem itself contained the day and hour of that promised coming in judgment.
So the command to be ready, to watch, that makes more sense if the event is imminent for them, not 2,000 years away.
Exactly. Telling them to be ready for something millennia off would seem odd.
And the comparison to Noah's day?
Fits perfectly. Once Noah and his family were sealed in the ark, the flood began immediately. There wasn't a long wait. And the flood that hit Jerusalem wasn't water, it was people. Josephus estimates maybe close to 3 million crammed into the city for Passover, right before the siege tightened. They were trapped partly because they listened to those false prophets telling them not to flee.
And one taken, one left. Not the rapture.
According to this view, no. Taken meant those who heeded the warning and were taken away to safety, like the Christians who fled to Pella. Left meant those who stayed behind in the doomed city and perished. It's about physical deliverance from that judgment.
Okay, the book also talks about the faithful and wise servant versus the evil servant. How does that fit the first century context?
The faithful servant is seen as the leadership within the Jerusalem church, the ones who understood Jesus' warnings and guided the believers to escape before the siege. The evil servant is the one who says, "My master's is delayed, delayeth his coming." This highlights that the New Testament expectation was imminence, not a long delay. Complacency was the danger. And the punishment for the unfaithful servant who gets caught up in worldly things. There's a grim parallel in Josephus. He describes deserters trying to smuggle gold out of Jerusalem by swallowing it. When they were caught by Syrian and Arabian auxiliaries with the Roman army, these soldiers started cutting them open to get the gold. Josephus says nearly 2,000 were dissected like this in one night. A horrific illustration of being consumed by wealth, eating and drinking with the drunken, instead of heeding the warning.
Good grief. That's incredibly dark. But it does fit the described consequences. This whole interpretation is, well, it's very different from what you usually hear. Does the author talk about why it's not the mainstream view? Why did people start looking to the future?
Yes, he does, and it's quite interesting. He points to various respected theologians and thinkers, even some non-believers throughout history who acknowledged the problem. People like William Barclay, Bertrand Russell, Paula Fredrickson, C.S. Lewis. They all looked at verses like Matthew 24:34, "This generation will not pass," and recognized Jesus seemed to explicitly promise a return within the apostles' lifetime. Lewis famously called it the most embarrassing verse in the Bible because, from his perspective, it looked like a failed prophecy. They struggled to reconcile the clear statement with what they thought hadn't happened.
So the argument isn't that Jesus was wrong, but that later interpretations missed the fulfillment that actually occurred.
Precisely. That's the core of this atavist perspective, as the book calls it. The Olivet Discourse was fulfilled point by point in the first century. Jewish revolutionaries committed the abomination in 67 CE. Christians fled. Romans besieged the city. And those catapult stones came flying in with the warning cry, "The sun cometh," in 70 CE.
And you mentioned earlier these other anomalous phenomena recorded by secular historians. Can you recap those quickly?
Sure. Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus both record strange events around that time. Things like a bright light around the temple altar at night in 62 CE, chariots and soldiers seen battling in the clouds over Judean cities in May 62, voices heard from within the Holy of Holies saying, "We're departing hence," also around that time. And maybe most striking, Tacitus mentions armies fighting in the clouds directly over Jerusalem itself around January 67 CE, right before that 3.5-year desecration period began. The source argues these aren't just random oddities, they align with Jesus' prediction of signs and wonders accompanying his coming and judgment. It suggests history itself bears witness.
So wrapping this up, what does this interpretation mean for people today? If Matthew 24 isn't about our future, what's the takeaway? This historical lens really does challenge the standard view. It shifts the focus from waiting for a future apocalypse to understanding a past fulfillment tied to the fall of Jerusalem.
Yeah, the implication is pretty profound. It means the kingdom came with power, as Jesus promised back then. It arrived as a spiritual reality, replacing the old temple system that was collapsing. And that cosmic language, sun darkened, moon bloodied, wasn't literal astronomy, but a powerful, established prophetic way of saying God was intervening, overthrowing an entire age, judging a nation.
It definitely makes you think differently. Instead of us being lookouts, scanning the horizon for future signs, this perspective presents us more as heirs, inheritors of a kingdom and a reality that was established back then, when all those things did take place. So maybe the question for you listening is, how does considering this historical fulfillment change how you read other prophecies? Or how you view the nature of God's promises and timing in Scripture? Something to mull over.